get started, and I'd like to welcome everyone to this session that was entitled History of Social Sciences in Central Eastern Europe. Our first speaker is Junona Almonaitienė from the Lithuanian University of Health Sciences, who will be speaking to us about vocational guidance in late Soviet Lithuania, its unintended outcomes.
Good morning, everyone. Do you hear me well? Okay, I'll try to fix it. And is it okay now? Okay. So it's a great pleasure for me to present the unintended outcomes of the vocational guidance in Lithuania. It was quite a new topic for me, but I was invited to collaborate in a collective monograph on psychology in late Soviet states. So,
hello. Okay.
Is it okay?
Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your help. Everyone was very modest. Okay, thank you. Let me start with a quote, or the book's title, to be more precise. Everything was forever until it was no more. This is the book of Alexei Yurchak, one of those who brought to light the paradoxicality of many facets of late Soviet society's reality and behavior. In my paper, I will present one particular expression of the paradoxes, a case of vocational guidance in late Soviet Lithuania and its unintended outcomes, which had so much to do with the history of psychology in the country. Let me introduce at first some context at first. So in the late 50s, decisions were made in Moscow to initiate modern vocational guidance. In 1958, the decree, so-called on strengthening the connection between school and life, was issued. The rationale was economical. The main reason was severe shortage of skilled so-called blue-collar workers and their uneven distribution in the USSR. Consequently, labor education and vocational guidance were institutionalized during the next decade. Vocational guidance was embedded into the USSR's educational system. However, as historians claim, the system did not solve the economical problems, mainly because of overestimation of the role of institutions on career decisions made by youth. Family values, social and economical factors had much stronger influence on them. Anyway, the decree was implemented, and in 1978, according to my data, all the municipal centers in Lithuania maintained vocational guidance offices. Of course, I can speak only about Lithuania here, as the Baltic states and some big cities in the USSR, for example, Kiev, were something like experimental sites for Soviet authorities because they could rely on creativity of workforce there. However, the creativity was difficult to control, and it could bring to unexpected results. Here in my slide, you can see psychologist Irena Krunglevičiūtė at her work in Kaunas Vocational Guidance Office in 1979. She was one of the participants of my research, as you will see further. Psychologists in Lithuania were highly interested in this new trend in the educational system. And I wonder if you thought about possibility to have psychological practice when any private practice is possible, because all private enterprises were forbidden, strictly forbidden in the USSR. The psychologists were completely dependent on placement in state institutions, and the lack of jobs for psychologists was a big problem. They were employed mainly in medical institutions, and they performed psychodiagnostics there. Some worked in factories, predominantly as sociologists. There were no positions for psychologists in schools directly in the places where they could reach pupils, basically until the independence of Lithuania. But on the whole, to implement the decisions already mentioned successfully, some psychological and pedagogical background had to be created. It is important to stress here that paradigmatic shift of Soviet pedagogy was already visible in the late 50s, and it revealed itself in the field of vocational guidance as well. The main direction of this shift was recognition of individuality and activity of a person or the inner subjective agent, the self, in educational processes. In Lithuania, there was a tradition in pedagogics from the pre-war, before the Second World War decades, to stress not only education but also fostering or pedagogic. It is quite difficult to translate into English for me. It was defined as the process of developing values and adequate relationships with oneself and surrounding world, and recognition of the activity of a subject or the target of the processes was also quite important. That fitted well with the paradigmatic shift and was developed further under the aegis of vocational guidance empowerment. In 1964, Leonas Jovaiša based theoretically the system of vocational guidance in Lithuanian secondary schools. Vocational guidance, according to him, is a specially organized system of educational work aimed at developing students' professional orientation, the ability to consciously choose a profession, and to help students in making their decisions. But let's read what was written in the booklet presenting that particular office in Kaunas. I'll read the translation, what is said there. I quote, "The employees of the Vocational Guidance Office are making every effort to honorably fulfill the tasks set by the party and the government by improving vocational guidance to achieve that more and more boys and girls consciously choose the professions most needed by the national economy." The last sentence sounds differently than in the slide before. However, it is the interpretation of the same idea of helping to choose consciously a profession and to help students in making a decision. But Lithuanian historians, and not only Lithuanian, those who rely on the analysis of documents in their research, they conclude that, I quote, the modernization of the educational discourse in Soviet Lithuania in the 60s and 70s changed the perception of vocational training in the educational system. Labor education and vocational guidance become the focus of the Soviet educational discourse, and offered a child-oriented vocational guidance framework, which was based on the knowledge of the child, motivational and interest-related education. However, this sophisticated approach was used to manipulate children and to ensure adequate supply of professionals for various key industries, alongside with the implementation of ideological tasks. On one hand, one could hardly disagree with this statement. On the other hand, I found it a bit one-sided as a pupil and later student of these days. So let me go now to the aim and methods of my research. This different interpretation encouraged me to investigate the role of psychologists in the system of vocational guidance in the late Soviet Lithuania. Of course, there are many methodological problems related to this. I will not go into the details, but you can understand that this recent history is quite difficult to make research on. I would call my method oral history, and the method requires identification of those who participated, so you can see some of those who were my interviewees. I made semi-structured interviews with some 10 of those who were employed in the offices of vocational guidance in the 70s and 80s in Lithuania. As a theoretical background, I took one research made by Lithuanian social scientists on late Soviet society, which mentions, for example, camouflage tactics, and the society itself, as they called that. Those camouflage tactics, they were related to doing what you think that it is needed, but somehow you pretend that you rely on those decisions on the Communist Party. So, for example, here in my slide, you can see how the Shortest Night was celebrated in 1983, pretending that these are simply, well, collective farmers, let me say so. But those who organized such enterprises, they wanted simply to maintain national identity and to celebrate other dates than those which were intended, yeah? But still, they are working youth in the countryside, and they are, yeah. You may understand that, yeah? So, speaking about psychologists, I asked my interviewees about how they understood their mission and role in the vocational guidance. So, as a result of my interview, data analysis, I found that the situation in the vocational guidance offices was far from what was intended. According to one psychologist, I quote, no one came because, you know, those pupils, they used to be there in the countryside, and we were in the city center. So you need to arrive if you want to consultation. But no one came, as you understood. This coincides with the conclusions of the historians who say, I quote, due to the agricultural structure and collectivization in rural areas, children were used there to physical work. Therefore, their labor education included helping collective farm workers and their parents during harvest periods. End of the quote. The life of children in big cities, regional centers, was easier, but vocational guidance officers encountered another challenge, lack of competent staff and equipment. And here I quote, I remember when I was in the 10th or 11th form in about 70s, our teacher took us. Those vocational guidance offices were just opened. They will do tests there, they will tell everything about me, I thought. And then it was, I remember as if today, Schulte table test, end of quote. The disappointed visitor became a psychologist herself later. The next quote illustrates how challenges were solved. I quote again. I came to work after graduation in August, and in October I need to explain to the school's principals how to work in schools with vocational guidance. Then I say, oh my God, well, but what to do? I need to prepare, you know. Now it's my preparation. It was Jovasha, I read his book, and I thought to myself, yes, things could be like that, end of quote. But by the way, the run-in of the pre-war psychotechnic society was used by this young psychologist. It was available from her senior colleagues. And yes, I can say that these words were by that lady who is here in the slide. And one more quite important quote is here, as one person told me. In Lithuania, one of the instructions of Moscow, according to the entire program created in Moscow, was that Lithuanian vocational guidance center had to be established, another one, because that first was not effective. To be honest, I wasn't interested in vocational guidance at all. But I was interested in the very possibility of establishing such a network of consulting offices in Lithuania. Well, I had been doing a lot of organizational work, and I knew almost all the psychologists practicing in Lithuania. So I thought that I had the resources needed, and I could. I said that I would like those offices to have a wider profile than vocational guidance. That I am ready to persuade and invite colleagues who know how to work, but who also know some counseling and psychotherapy for various groups of people. This is the end of my quote. So here I already go to my conclusions, what I disclosed during my investigation. I will say that my investigation disclosed that psychologists were quite numerous in the educational system in late Soviet Lithuania. Their influence was quite limited in comparison with the aims of the system of vocational guidance. They lacked appropriate training and skills. Some could rely on the pre-Second World War methods of psychotechnics delivered by senior colleagues and to develop them further. I could also claim that the omnipresent phenomena of double lives in state socialism was characteristic to psychologists working in the system of vocational guidance that brought to quite unintended consequences. The network of vocational guidance officers was a lucky chance in seeking to develop psychology as a discipline and its institutionalization in Lithuania. A number of networks of officers outgrew into psychotherapy centers with a wider profile as soon as it was possible. The implemented system of vocational guidance in Lithuania brought increasing psychologization of the youth's transition from secondary school to higher and specialized secondary education instead of its primary aim. On the whole, the reality of vocational guidance was multifarious and remains understudied. Thank you for your attention here, and we could discuss.
I love the project, and I think you made its outlines very clear in your short presentation. The reason I like it is, like, how do you study motivations of people? And, you know, we look at institutions. Sometimes you can do it through looking at the church, for example, in a particular society. It's not about religion, it's about everything else in their lives. And if you think of Soviet structure, you know, the vocational center is almost like a church, that everything depends on it and everything is working on. Also, it's terribly hard to do it, even in a stable society, you know, advising young people on their plans and getting their ambitions and their plans to mix together is always hard. So there's all those complications normally. But you're looking at an extraordinary time, right at this end of the Soviet period. I remember being in East Germany right after the wall came down and talking with young people sitting on the streets and cafes and hearing about their plans and ambitions. And I was just overwhelmed with their energy and all that they told me. So I imagine the people working in these vocational areas would have this kind of information. So what are your expectations about all you will learn about Lithuanian society, and maybe Lithuanian young people or Lithuanian professionals like these psychologists? Do you have any early results?
Yes, you are right that people somehow they tried to simply to survive, yeah, to do something what they would like. And there is a quote which I omitted during my presentation. Perhaps it could answer your question. This is about that lady which had to prepare just after her start of her career. She said, and then I felt myself pretty good. I thought, well, a young person is lost, and it's good that things could be fairer, more according to her. Well, maybe I can contribute a little to it, so that her preferences wouldn't be completely odd. And I'm fine with that. I worked in the office for some 10 years, you can see, when she worked, yeah. And by the way, in big cities, we as school children, we were informed about possibility to be consulted, and I also came to that office. I was consulted by young psychologists there, and then I decided to become psychologist. So, you know, it's quite strange because, yeah, they were intended to guide those blue-collar workers, but they did different things. I don't know, did I answer? And you?
Yeah, I find it an amazing case. And also nicely linked to what Winske presented yesterday about the psychotechnics in Colonial, where the personality was so important, like a theme, and in this different context where it's so because it was always this tension, right, between assessing the person as an individual and the social needs.
Yeah.
So in this sense, this is a very nice counterexample in a setting where the social needs are the first, right, and the person is the second. So it's amazing. So I have a lot of questions, but it's basically, did it really start at that time? Because there was psychotechnics before in the Soviet area, and then they were closed, these institutes. So
those institutions of thank you at first for your nice interpretation. And what was easier perhaps in Lithuania, that those so-called social needs, they were not important for those who worked in vocational guidance offices, because no one wanted to collaborate with what was came from Moscow. So this was not a priority to anyone. Speaking about those who were my participants of my research. And speaking about psychotechnics, this term was forbidden in the USSR, but as you can see, some simply relied on that, and some people that psychologists she still have, and she brought me those papers from the Second World War Lithuanian Psychotechnic Society with the questions about professions and so forth, and she simply used, but it was illegal. If someone knew that she relies on that, it could be very bad. But her senior colleagues simply they trusted her, and she, as she said, she somehow tried to combine that book of Jovaiša, which was written officially to create the background for vocational guidance in Soviet Lithuania, and that pre-war run in psychotechnics, and she created something. But it was a case also interesting told by that lady. She said that the delegation from Iran was brought to her to explain how to implement vocational guidance, and she was not she, but the representative of the educational system, a man, was asked, could Madame answer the question how to do that and that, and the delegation from Iran was also consulted by her, because, as I said, Lithuania and other countries, they were as experimental sites, and perhaps Soviet authorities knew that they can rely on that pre-war knowledge. It was not possible in some other places.
I thought really interesting. I have maybe a question or it's a question about methodology, and I thought it was very interesting the kind of the contrast between an official discourse that's really on kind of orienting them in a particular direction in the right way, and then their experience of it. And I was wondering how you considered your oral histories. Is it a form of testimony for you, or are you really looking at the discourse very closely and the vocabulary they use? Because I know that there's a whole big vocabulary for guiding, orienting, and then this focus on the choice, which I thought was interesting too. So how is the vocabulary used, and where does it come from, or how is it subverted in certain situations?
Yes, thank you for the question. As I already mentioned, it is quite difficult to do. Yeah, what I started doing already in 2016. Simply, I started to record interviews, but my aim was a bit different. Yeah, I simply wanted to know some details, to report some details. Because, for example, for any kind of interpretation, you need to know the facts at first. Who worked, how many offices, when, and so on. Yeah, no one does research on that because people simply, well, for so many reasons, as you can understand. Yeah, it is difficult to do research. Some think it is unimportant. For example, in case of vocational guidance, people simply say, let's forget that vocational guidance. It's not what we intended. Yes, we simply did what we could there. Yeah, but it's not, I'm not interested in that anymore. My initial thought was simply to report something. And by the way, now I published one interview with my former professor. You can see, well, you can't see. Okay. You can see her with the sunglasses here. On methods, which she was very innovative in methodology of psychology those days, and she was my supervisor. Yeah, but now I simply interpret all these interviews in various kinds. Yeah, we can speak about vocabulary. We can, and so in this particular presentation, I simply concentrated on that relationship, how people now understand their role, what they did there and why, and what was their experience. And as I told you about the successful case, but the other colleague who is on the top in this side, she told that no one came. Simply, and she, after sitting in that empty office for a year, she went to study to her doctoral degree. Yeah, and she left the office, and perhaps another person came, but he or she was also sitting in that empty office. Yeah, because no one comes.
We are going to have to.
Very
fast.
It's very fast. It's I've of course, you know, I've been working on energetics, but in other centuries before, and there's a lot of tension between parents and these kind of people coming to do guidance and say, is that something you see as well, or is it not parents? So parents want the child to do one thing, vocational guidance officer kind of finding out with the child they need to do something else, and what happens then? Is it something?
So you ask on about the family, yeah, as I understand.
Yes, family pressure.
Yeah, you know, I mentioned for several times the historian who made her research about the family influence. Also, she relied mainly on interviews and on the documents. So she writes widely that family was who decides. Because, yeah, to survive even economically was very difficult. People were poor, especially in the countryside, those collective farmers, they were extremely poor. And family wanted them to go somewhere to big cities, to work, to earn something, to have professions, yeah? And most of them became engineers, mainly. Yeah, this was what was sought by most, because industry was developed. Okay.
We're sadly going to have to interrupt. We're